In the 1950s, Avis Acres published a series of New Zealand picture books. Though fantasy, these books contained a wealth of information about the New Zealand bush and animal life. They had a strong theme of conservation, which placed them years ahead of their time. Avis also wrote New Zealand nature books for use in schools and illustrated a chart of New Zealand birds that is still being sold today. Her work is a vital record of our natural heritage. Avis, your stories show that you've got a very great knowledge of wildlife in New Zealand. Have you always loved nature, or has it been something that you've studied?
Yes, always, all my life, because we were very fortunate. When I was small, we always seemed to have a beautiful garden. There were several of them, but lovely gardens. And I can remember back, I must have been about 4 or 5, and I used to make little fairy dells. And my mother usually supplied a dish or something to put water in, and I made a hollow in the ground and filled it with water and put moss all round the edge of it and stuck little flowers in for the fairies. And I used to tell Mother that the fairies used to come down when I wasn't there and have a bathe in the little pool and drink water from it. And I swore that if I had nasty medicine to take and put it down in the fairy dell, that the taste would go, the nasty taste would go.
Oh.
But I remember playing in the garden for hours with my fantasies, my little stories that I made up myself. And then my doll family, of course, I had a large doll family, and my favourites were a rag doll called Minnie and a teddy bear who I adored. And we had lovely trees. I remember one house on Grange Road in Auckland. We had a lovely garden with a bit of bush at the back and a huge oak tree in the middle of the lawn. And I used to say to myself that oak tree was where our family and I lived. And I'd take all the family up, and each branch was a bedroom. Some of their clothes came too, all the dolls came up. It must have taken me ages getting up and down. And we lived in the townhouse, and then I'd think all the dolls looked a bit pale, and we'd go to the seaside. Well, the seaside batch was a big tree. I think it was a puriri, I'm not sure, but it was by the gate, and part of the branches hang over the road. Well, the road in my mind was the sea, the footpath was the beach, and our house sort of overlooked the beach, and all the dolls were taken up there. Oh, silly little things like that I used to imagine.
They're not silly though, are they? They're a part of the
Yes,
rituals of
they
your
are
childhood.
part of it. And then we had this lovely bit of bush at the back. But I always seemed to grow up, and then we moved to another lovely garden. And I remember my grandmother lived with us, and she had a great love of garden too. And she planted panterberry bells, which made lovely little fairies, and fuchsias, which made lovely fairies, and of course later came into my books, the fuchsias. I used to play with these things and teach my little sisters and brother to play with them too later on. But when I was learning, before the sisters arrived, the first sister arrived when I was 5, and the next one when I was 6, and the little brother came 2 years later. So they were wonderful material for telling stories too. So I started telling stories before I wrote them, really.
But in your books you actually show a knowledge as well. Obviously you have a great knowledge of nature. When did you actually become conscious of needing to know the real part of it as well?
Probably that didn't come till much later, because there was a busy time in my life when we were rather hard up and my mother wasn't well, and I was too worried to think about stories. But later on, I was always interested, of course, in the bush, and when I became engaged, we went for lovely tramps up in the Waitakeries and in Auckland, and visited the various islands and the harbour. And I loved the bush in those days too, but the real, but earlier on, when I was about 7 years old, I visited a farm, the first time I'd ever been on a farm, and I had a wonderful time on that farm. It was near Paraparaumu, up in the hills, and I stayed with an old uncle and aunt and a cousin, and a little stream ran through the farm, and I think that's where I got my ideas of a stream in the Hutu and Kawa books. And I used to play for hours by the stream. I used to feed the eels when they came with crumbs, and I dammed up the stream, and I used to invent all sorts of creatures around the stream. And for hours I played in that lovely garden, and they had a bit of bush on the farm too. And I became rather antagonistic towards opossums in those days, because they used to come out of the bush and play games on the roof at night and keep me awake. So I think that was my first feelings against opossums. But then that all went by the way, and that all came back later. But I think it wasn't until some years later that I really began thinking of writing stories about the bush and that sort of thing. And I came across those lovely books, Australian books of Bib and Bub, the government babies, and I thought of all the adventures they had in the Australian bush, and I thought, well, our bush would provide some wonderful stories for children if I turned the various flowers into fairies and people. So that's when I started writing the ideas about Hutu and Kawa, the pōhutukawa babies, and went on to the government, to the Kauai kiddies and all the various ones, the future fairies, and that's where it all came out then.
So those Australian books actually were the instigator, perhaps, or the things that prompted you to actually
well, those
write
were the things that prompted
well.
me, really.
Have you ever written for adults as well, or have you always just been interested in
Oh
writing for children?
no, I started a little, I joined the Women Writers Society in Levin. I was asked to join that, and I later started, when we moved to Levin from Taupo, I started a group of women writers there, and several of us were interested, and we used to set ourselves stories to write, subjects to write, and I sent various articles and things away, and I did a radio script. I was asked to do that on country newsletters. That was quite interesting. They wrote to people in different country areas, and of course when we were in Taupo in the early days, it was very few people there, and it was really in the waybacks in those days. And so I wrote a country letter about Taupo, and another country newsletter about my visit to Kapiti Island, and that led to about 3 or 4 newsletters. But we used to write stories. I didn't have much success with my adult stories. It was always children I wanted to write for.
So it was quite early in your life that you realised that it was in a children's
Yes, it was
children's
really.
books that you
I think through telling stories to my young sisters and brother, really.
And your love of the environment too, right
Yes.
from when you were little, that obviously
Yes,
is
well,
why
you
that
see, we
comes
always
through
had a
in your
lovely
books.
garden, and that fostered it, really.
Yes, yeah. Because that very strong conservational theme in your books, and I think your books are published in the 1950s.
Yes.
That was years ahead of its time, wasn't it? That
Yes, well, it
actual
was
theme.
years ahead of its time, really, and I think that's why I was lucky in getting it helped to get my books accepted, because Mr. Reid, in those days, there were very few books for children, little children, about New Zealand, and he wrote about New Zealand himself, and of course had some very good books for going through the schools, and I think that was why I was so lucky in getting them published by Reid's.
Your books originally had a print run, I read somewhere, of 10,000 copies, a print run, the very first one
Yes,
each.
well, each one he printed 10,000 of, and then he did the first one sold out in a year, The Adventures of Hutu and Kawa, and he printed, a year later he printed another 5,000 of those, and they all sold out.
They were phenomenal print runs. I mean,
Well,
they're
it was
amazing
amazing
for,
for those days,
and especially.
but it shows there was a dearth of children's literature, and also you must remember there was no television.
Mm.
So they had to, that was why they went so well, I think, because there was no television to interrupt. And I think it was possibly, later on, it might have been much harder to get them published in that quantity.
Mm.
But evidently people were ready for them then, and they certainly did very well.
Did you get letters and
Oh, I had
things
some
from
lovely
children who
letters,
read them?
yes. But first of all, I had the idea that when I started thinking of writing books, I thought if I could get onto a children's page in the Herald or the Star, a regular feature every Saturday, it would probably familiarise people with my books, with my stories, and the books might have a better sale. So I started writing these little things about halfway through our marriage, I suppose. I started this idea of the stories, and I started drawing all these birds and things, and I thought, gosh, they're badly drawn. I'll have to draw them much better than that. I'll have to really see a lot of birds to get them done properly. So I used to trail down from Hamilton, where we lived then, to the museum in Auckland, and I sketched all these dead stuffed birds. That was no good. The stuffed birds were not what I wanted for my story, the illustrations. So I joined the Forest and Bird Society, a nice group of people, and we went off for our trip through the bush. I think it was in the Mc Neill. And the birds went for their lives when they saw this huge crowd of people all coming through their bush. I had no chance to sketch any birds. So that was no good. So I knew that really to get good sketches of birds, I would have to go to a bird sanctuary. That was quite a problem. In those days, by this time we had moved to Taupo, and it was a terrific business trying to get to Kapiti Island Bird Sanctuary, which I thought would be a good place to sketch birds. I had to write to the Department of Inland Affairs and get permission, and then I was going to hold a list of instructions. I was not to bring any animals on to the island. I had to bring all my own food. I had to bring a supply for twice as long as I was going to be there, in case we were stuck there with the weather. Anyhow, all these things I managed to attend to. I didn't take any cats or anything with me, and I had plenty of food, and I decided I'd like to stay for a week. And I made arrangements to be taken over to the island with a caretaker, and the caretaker met me at Paraparamu Beach. And we went, I thought he'd be taking me over on a launch or something, but it was a little sort of dinghy thing. And we went like this, and as a rule, I'm a terrible sailor. But do you know, I forgot all about my interior, because little blue penguins were swimming on either side of the boat. Gannets were diving for fish overhead. Everything I could want was on that trip over to the island. And we came to the island eventually, and we walked up through the bush, and bellbirds were singing, and I could see them. Tuis were all around me. Little tomtits fluttered round in front of me, and suddenly there was an awful squawk, and a great big bird, like a parrot, flew over my head, and I realised it was a kaka. And the caretaker said, "Don't worry, he's not going to dive bomb you. He's annoyed because we have arrived at his afternoon break time when he's fed with dates." He said, "My wife always comes out with dates about 3:30, and the kakas know she's coming and are all ready for her. So you'll be in time to see him have his dates." Well, we walked up, and all the birds singing. It was just like a dream come true. I couldn't imagine it was real. And we came up to this clearing, and there was the caretaker's cottage, and his wife on the lawn, surrounded by kakas. One was on her head, another was on her shoulder, and they were all round, and he was feeding with dates. and I was so busy looking at them, I hardly noticed what else was around me. On the lawn outside were a couple of wood pigeons strolling round like a couple of fowls, feeding off the grass and things. Took no notice of me at all. A flock of little red-fronted parakeets flew down while I was there, and they started rapping around for food on the lawn, little seeds or things. Took no notice of me whatsoever. And then a greyish bird came wandering around. He sort of took a quick look at me, oh, who are you? And went on with his work. And that apparently was a wicker. And I became very friendly with him later. I called him Willie. Well, eventually I was shown down to the little place where I was to live, which was known as the Wharry. And it was an old place about 100 years old, where a missionary had once lived on the island. And it consisted then of two great big rooms that probably all the sides were taken down before, but it was two big rooms when I was there. And there was an enormous open fireplace where one did all one's cooking on the open fire with driftwood gathered from the beach. And the other was a bedroom with several beds in it, big bedroom, and over one bed was a beautiful driftwood angel. So I chose that bed. And oh, I was so happy there. It was just heaven, because there were big French windows on the two outdoors that looked right onto the tops of the trees, because the trees were growing down the bank, so the tops were facing the French window. And I knew that Kakas were fond of dates, and I had brought a packet with me, fortunately. When he showed me down to this foreign place where I was to sleep, and I started unpacking. And by this time, of course, the Kakas would have finished their meal up above on the lawn, and they decided to follow me down and see what was happening with me. And you know that extraordinary feeling you get when somebody's looking at you and you can't see them, but you feel somebody's looking at you? Well, I went and looked outside, and I noticed some of the leaves were sort of moving, and then I saw a grey head peer through, and then another grey head peer through, and the Kaka family had all come down to see if there was any more food. So I opened the packet of dates, and by the way, several of these Kakas were named. There was Hector and Charlie, and one poor old thing called Dopey, who wasn't quite all there, all that a Kaka should be mentally. And poor old Dopey was always last getting a feed because he was so slow. Well, anyhow, I saw them all there on the branches, and I held a date out to, I think it was Charlie, and he came bustling along the branch and grabbed it with his beak, put it in his claw and started eating it, and then the others did the same. And then poor old Dopey came very slowly along the branch, and I held out the date, and he got it in his claw. And while he was looking at it like that and deciding whether to eat it or not, Charlie came rushing along, ate the date and went off. So after that I was very good to Dopey. I kept all the others at bay and fed him. Well, I've done lots of photos, lots of sketches, of course, all the birds there. They were just sitting targets, they didn't care at all. And Willie Wecker turned out, I'm afraid, to be a thief. I hung my dishcloth mop outside the door to dry, and I went into the bush, and when I came back he was running off with it, and I got a lovely picture of him running off with it. And of course in my next story, Hutu and Kawa Find an Island, Willie Wecker was a thief, and he stole Hutu and Kawa's cloaks. He did all sorts of naughty things. But anyhow, the first morning I was there, I was wakened by the dawn chorus, which is the most wonderful thing to be wakened by. It was absolutely wonderful. And I heard, after the dawn chorus, I heard a peculiar sort of squeak by my bedside, and I looked down, and there was Willie Wecker. And I don't know what he was trying to tell me, but I think he probably knew I was going to make myself a cup of tea, and he would want a little sustenance. So I went and made a cup of tea, and he followed me out of the kitchen, and I gave him a little bit of bread and butter. After that, he was with me for every meal, never left my side. And knowing the experience of the disc mop, when I sketched outside, I put my paintbrushes in a paper bag. thinking they'd be safe while I was sketching. But no, I heard a rustle, and there was Master Willie with my whole bag full of brushes, rushing across the lawn into the beach, dropping them as he went. So then I think I put them on a high, I forget where I put them, but anyhow I managed to keep them out of his sight. But he accompanied me down to the beach every night when I went to get driftwood for the fire. And I quite liked his company because there were rats about, and he didn't like rats, so that was quite good for me. And the lovely experience of going down to the beach just as the sun was setting and seeing the lights, all the light over Wellington was just incredibly beautiful. And once I saw a little ripple and a seal came swimming slowly by. And then I used to go back with my driftwood and light a great big fire and cook my dinner over the open fire. It was such fun. And but I used to wander around the bush, and I realised that birds, you've got to be very careful. You mustn't let them know that you've come to watch them. So I used to pretend to be a log or something and sit down on the log and be very quiet, and presently they came along and sort of went about their business. And the dear little birds who fed on the ground, like the little native robin, they used to go about their business, getting the little worms and things, and one came almost onto my foot. And of course I had a wonderful, easy job sketching them. And the little native robin I got to know quite early in the visit, because when the dawn chorus was on, I heard this beautiful voice of a bird I didn't know, and I thought it might have been the native robin, because I'd read that it had a beautiful song and it sounded quite close. So I went out to investigate and I found this little tiny bird about the size of a tomtit or a sparrow on a branch at eye level, bursting his little heart singing. And I thought, I must get a... He didn't take any notice of me at all. He was too busy singing. And I knew that must be the little native robin. So I went and got my sketchbook, and for half an hour I sketched him while he was singing. And he never took any notice of me at all. And then, of course, later I met him in the bush.
Your books, excuse me a second, your books have got that beautiful aliveness, and your pictures of your animals
well,
in your
well,
books.
that's what I was trying to get for my stories. They had to be friends of Hutu and Kawa. Therefore, they had to be very much alive. And I wanted to get all their different habits. And, of course, the way to get an idea of a person's character is to watch them eating. And the caretaker said I could come and watch them, all the birds feeding at his bird table, honey and nectar and water. And there I sketched bellbirds, tuis, kakas, and all sorts of birds along, all of the honey eaters. And the tuis had no table manners at all. They were very rough and unruly and bullies. And the poor little shy bellbird, had to sort of keep behind till it was her turn. So I got to know a lot of the characters that way.
Did you ever did you always draw from live models, or did you ever do a book from photographs?
Well, I had to study photographs because claws and beaks and things like that you couldn't get when you were just doing a quick sketch of a bird. You had to get the details right, and I had this inner urge to have everything as perfect as I could. I wanted the claws to be right and the beaks to be right and all the rest of it. And years later I found that very helpful, because I was asked to write illustrate a chart of birds, New Zealand birds and birds in New Zealand, and it's just sold out recently, and it's been going for about 14 years. I put it over there. And I was asked to do 60 birds, New Zealand birds and birds in New Zealand. And I'd done most of those from sketches, live sketches, but I had to get the details right and their beaks right and their feathers right and all the rest of it. So I had to go back to the museum this time in Wellington and study all the feathers and study the beaks and the claws. And I got a lot of them from photographs too, to get them perfect. For some reason I wanted to get it absolutely right, but of course for that I had to have it exactly right.
You also wrote a book about Opo the dolphin. didn't you?
Yes.
Would you like to tell us
Now
about
that, I'm afraid, I did entirely from photos. I read it all in the newspaper and decided I must write a book about Opo. And we had been to Opanoni and taken photos. We had taken a photo of the old hotel up there. So I knew the district, but I knew I must write that book fairly quickly. And so I'd kept all the photos from the papers, thinking I'd be writing this book. And then I wanted better photos, so a neighbour had a whole pile of illustrated geographic magazines. So I asked if I could go through those, and I found excellent photos of dolphins in America, in some of these places where they had them. There was even a photo of a dolphin being born. And I kept all those photos, which I'm afraid I stole. I had to photograph them. I put them in my own settings, but I had to have them correct. And I loved doing that Opo book. And that was the one that I sent to read, and he immediately accepted it because he wanted to get it. He gave me, he said he couldn't give me a deadline because the deadline was now. He wanted to get it published with the Thyra book for the next Christmas, so I had to do it all in 3 weeks, the illustrations and everything, which nearly killed me.
have any trouble getting your stories published? Was it
when I first got Hutu and Kawa, I was very lucky getting them into the Herald, of course, because the children's editor there was an ornithologist. She took beautiful photos, and she was looking round for a story about the New Zealand bush when I walked in with mine. So she welcomed me with open arms, and we became great friends, and we had some lovely bird watching holidays together. And she took wonderful photos of the Auckland Weekly News that were published. And we went for a lovely holiday down by the Opahi River and walked up the shingle bank and sketched birds in their nesting grounds further up the river. She had a hide and erected it, and I went in with her into the hide and came out again later because birds can't count, and they thought there was nobody in that hide. So she had wonderful pictures of them going about their birdie business, thinking they were on their own, whereas poor me, I had to lie on my tummy to sketch in detail a dear little baby banded dotterel, which thought it looked like pebbles, but it didn't.
Did you have to do a lot of reading research about the insects' lives, or did you learn it all just from observation?
That was difficult, very difficult. We lived in Taupo, and there was no library for that sort of thing. I had to go all the way down to Auckland to the library to research about snails and worms and butterflies and all sorts of things to get all the facts right. And I was given a very, very simple vocabulary that I had to stick to for children from about 5 to 7 years old, and yet get all my facts right and write a readable story. So it was quite an assignment, but I loved doing that sort of thing. I loved doing research. And we had no grass down at Taupo in those days, no daisies about, and I had to do buttercup and a daisy. And so I sent for friends in November to send me down some earth with a daisy plant in it so I could sketch a daisy. It sounded so silly, but it all had to be right. And the old oak and the young apple tree, that was another one I did. And Buzzy Bumble and Minnie Monarch.
But it's that lovely eye to detail and that love that comes through in your drawings.
Well, I was very lucky with the book on the cats and the dogs, because we had a dear old spaniel, of course, which I loved dearly, and we had a little wild cat that we tamed, and she was going to have kittens, and my husband made a lovely little place for her in the garage, and a box full of shavings and things, and we showed it to her. Well, she evidently remembered that, and one day we were just going out on a Sunday afternoon for a drive, and she came up to us and seemed to be wanting to get our attention, and she walked ahead of us and looked round to see if we were following. We followed her. We followed her into the garage, and she looked round to see if we were quite sure we were there. And then she hopped up onto the bench and into the box of shavings and peered over the top. And that's as much as to say, now, when you come back, I'll have something to show you. And she did. She had 3 kittens. So I was able to write the story of the kittens, how long she nursed them, and when they came to look after themselves, teaching them to wash themselves, all this sort of thing. And she used to kill rabbits for them and bring a rabbit tail for them to play with, and pretend it was a mouse, I suppose. And so that was all came into my book. So I was so lucky having that.
That's really beautiful, because so much of your life went into your books. They weren't just drawn and illustrated and written from things that you'd observed.
Really part of my life.
Yeah,
Yes, it was really.
Came from right within yourself. Avis, is there any very special thing that's happened in your life that you would like to share with us?
Well, going back, I think it probably might have stemmed from, we went for a camping trip about a year after we were married, and we went right up north, and we came to the Waipua forest. And I was just overcome with that forest. The tranquility, the peace, and the lovely feeling of nature, these huge, tremendous trees, and to think that some of those kauri trees had been there before Captain Cook came to set New Zealand, and would go on growing after that, hundreds of years old. And the birds singing, and this, it was a sort of most indescribable feeling. And I've thought about it so much ever since. And I thought about, now those big trees, they reach their allotted span, and then they die, and the big log lies there. But there's no sense of decay, because in no time it's covered in moss and little orchids and tiny little plant scrap on it, and little red and white toadstools, and beautiful little ferns, and it's all alive again. And but at the back of my mind were all my little creatures, that I wanted to write about. And then I read May Gibbs' little books, and I thought, now that's where I can bring in native flowers and the birds. And that's what started me off in Hutu and Kawa, and I thought of all the things that we have in our forest, all the lovely flowers. But I was stuck for animals. You see, they had a lot of animals, and so I had to get in a lot of animals like tuatara, and a little native frog I brought in, and a kiori, the rat, and various animals. And I had to I was very lucky, because Mr. Turbot, who was the head of the museum in Auckland, I'd become quite friendly with him, and I asked him about why there wasn't a tuatara that I could sketch, and he said, well, we don't stuff tuataras, but he said, if you'd like to look at a live one, I'll take you up to the museum top. There's one up top of the museum. So he took me up there, and I looked around, there was no sign of a tuatara, and he said, over in the drain pipe there, and I saw this head sticking out of the drain pipe. A great big eye looked at me, you see, and he said, well, look, I've got to go down now, I'll leave you here to sketch him, and I'll come back later. Well, when he came back later, all I had to show him was the drain pipe and tuatara's head sticking out of it. And he said, oh, we'll have to do better than that. And he went and got a glass showcase and put it on the table and plonked tuatara into it. And tuatara turned his back on me and put one paw on the back of the thing and the other paw like that. And he was the frontispiece, the cover of my first book, the tuatara book. He was the cover, that sketch. Well, then he gave me a letter of introduction to Mr. The head of the department in Victoria University in Wellington, and he was most helpful, because he had a whole lot of live tuataras that I could sketch. and he allowed me to come. He gave me a table to sketch things on. And all ages, I sketched tuatara, and he was delighted. I was writing a book for children about tuatara. And later on, he had an exhibition of his work, and he asked me to send one of my drawings of a tuatara down. I was quite thrilled with that. Mm-hmm. And he and Mr. Turbot both wrote very nice little letters to put on my books, assuring people that all my facts were correct, and there wasn't room to put them in the books, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you very much for sharing all those special things with us, Avis.
The Adventures of Hutu and Kawa. Once upon a time, an old tree grew by the sea at the edge of the forest. At Christmas time, she was covered with masses of bright red flowers. She was often called the Christmas tree, but her real name was pōhutukawa. High up in the tree there was a little nest house. The roof was thatched with dry ferns. It was very warm and cosy inside the little house. The walls were made of grass, twigs and cobwebs, and were lined with feathers. In it lived 2 tiny pōhutukawa babies. Their names were Hutu and Kawa. They were very happy little people. Every day they played with their friends, the birds and the forest folk, and at night the old tree rocked the babies gently to and fro in her strong arms, and her leaves rustled a soft lullaby until at last Hutu and Kawa fell asleep. One morning, while they were playing by the bank of the stream which ran through the forest, Hutu thought of a wonderful idea. "Kawa," he cried, "let's build a canoe. If we had a canoe, we could go exploring up the stream. I wonder who would help us. There must be somebody in the forest who knows how to build a canoe." His brother thought it was a splendid idea. "Kawa, what fun! We might have exciting adventures. We'd have to build it properly, because if we didn't it might leak and then we'd be drowned." "I know who would help us," said Kawa. "Grandpa Kiwi. I'm sure he'd know how to build a canoe. Let's go and ask him straight away." They set off hand in hand to visit their old friend in the forest. Grandpa Kiwi slept. Yes, I was reading stories to a group of little children, you see, and I was reading about a wicked wolf. And of course I became the wolf, and I got so excited about being the wolf and his voice that suddenly my upper dentures shot across the room into the laps of one of the children. And I thought they'd be convulsing kids, but they were all like this, wide-eyed. They thought it was all part of the story, you see. And I hurriedly retrieved the teeth, put them back, and continued with the wolf. And in the background, but I was amazed that these children never laughed, it was all part of the story. And in the background, I saw a man in fits at the back who'd heard the whole thing and seen it, and was a reporter from the Chronicle where my husband worked. And I went up to him and I said, "Now look, how much is it worth to you to keep this out of the Chronicle?" He was very good. He didn't report it. But those little children, probably when their mums read that library book, it wouldn't be so exciting with no teeth dropping out.